Greg Holman was the kind of man people described as steady, dependable, the kind of guy who never raised his voice, never stirred drama, never changed up his routine. He worked a union job at the local grain elevator, paid his bills on time, and still parked in the exact same spot at the grocery store every Friday night. In a town like Marlow, Illinois, where most people had known each other since Little League, Greg was someone everyone just assumed would always be around. But on the evening of April 17th, 2005, he wasn't. It was a Sunday, a quiet one, the kind of Midwest spring evening where the air still carried a little winter chill. Greg had just finished dinner, baked chicken and green beans, leftovers from the night before. His 17-year-old son, Kyle, was upstairs doing homework. The TV hummed softly in the background. Greg stood up from the table, rinsed his plate, and like clockwork, grabbed his jacket from the hook by the door. He called out that he was going for a drive. He said he'd be back in an hour. It wasn't anything new. Since his wife, Amy, had passed away 3 years earlier, Greg had taken these drives almost every evening. Sometimes he'd go to the gas station for a coffee. Sometimes he'd just cruise county roads, windows down, talk radio playing. People said it helped him clear his head. He never stayed out long. That night, Greg never came back. By 10:30 p.m., Kyle started to get nervous. At first, he told himself it was fine. Maybe his dad had gone to see a friend or lost track of time, but by midnight, there was no sign of him. No text, no call. His phone rang straight to voicemail. The car was gone. Greg wasn't answering. Kyle didn't wait till morning. He called 911 just after 12:10 a.m. The dispatcher took the report seriously, but gently reminded him that his father had only been gone a few hours. Still, an officer was sent out. Deputy Tom Reese arrived at 12:41 a.m. to take the missing persons report. He looked around the house, nothing out of place. Greg's wallet, cell phone, and keys, all gone, just like he was. His car, a 2001 silver Honda Accord, wasn't in the driveway. There was no sign of struggle, no note, no open tabs on the computer. Just a normal night cut short. By morning, word had spread through town. Co-workers, friends, neighbors. No one had seen Greg, and no one had heard from him. Kyle was calling hospitals, calling his uncle in Springfield, calling anyone who might have an answer. But the answer never came. Police started canvassing routes Greg was known to take. Officers drove miles of back roads, checked gas stations, and pulled traffic cam footage from intersections. There was nothing. The Accord didn't show up on any nearby street cameras. No one had reported a crash. And despite searching for hours, no one could find even a trace, not a skid mark, not a taillight fragment, not a scent trail for the dogs to follow. It was like the car, and Greg had simply evaporated. By day 3, the search went wide. A helicopter scanned the surrounding forest and river routes. Drones weren't common then, so it came down to boots on the ground. Volunteers walked fields and trails. Greg's photo was stapled to telephone poles and pinned to diner bulletin boards. Everyone was looking, but every road turned up empty. Greg had no known enemies, no history of depression, no affairs, no money problems, no reason to run. He wasn't on medication. His bank accounts were untouched. His last purchase had been gas and a bottle of iced tea, time-stamped 6:12 p.m., 15 minutes before he left the house. To everyone who knew him, this wasn't a man on the edge. This was a man grieving, yes, but a man still present, still trying, still raising a son. Investigators began to consider darker possibilities. Was it a robbery gone wrong? Carjacking? Did Greg pull over to help someone and end up in the wrong place at the wrong time? But if that were true, where was the car? Where was the body? A week in, the case hit a wall. No new leads, no evidence. Greg's license plate was added to national databases. The Accord became a ghost car, a moving question with no answer. Kyle stopped going to school. He spent his days staring at maps, retracing roads with a highlighter. His relatives took shifts staying at the house. Friends came less and less. The town moved on in the way small towns often do, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't know how to help. A missing man, no suspects, no clues. It was a void no one could explain. Years would pass. The posters would come down. But the questions never did. What makes a man like Greg Holman disappear without a trace? Why would a devoted father leave in silence on a route he'd taken 100 times before and never return? And how does a car just vanish from a town with only 2 stoplights and 1 way out? Those were the questions people asked, but no one had answers. Not then. Not for a very long time. By the second day of Greg Holman's disappearance, the urgency had shifted from concern to fear. In a town like Marlow, people didn't just vanish. If someone's car broke down, someone else noticed. If a driver ran off the road, there would be tire tracks, broken branches, something. But there was nothing. No calls, no accidents reported, no credit card activity, just the empty driveway and the gnawing sense that something was very wrong. Sheriff's deputies set up a search perimeter covering a 15-mile radius around town. They started with what they called the comfort roads, the routes Greg was known to take on his evening drives. County Road 6, the loop past the grain silos, the stretch of asphalt that traced the riverbank. Patrol cruisers drove slowly, scanning culverts, drainage ditches, and tree lines. Helicopters were called in again, this time with infrared. Nothing turned up. Then came a report. A farmer named Dale Tucker called the sheriff's office to say he thought he'd seen a silver sedan speeding down the river road the night Greg disappeared. He wasn't sure of the make or model, but it was around 7 p.m., and he remembered it because it was rare to see anyone driving that fast down there. The road ran parallel to the Embry River, a remote winding stretch with no lighting and sharp turns. Known for erosion and drop-offs, it had guardrails in some areas, but not all. If a car went off there, it could take days, maybe weeks, to find. Deputies shifted the search. Dive teams were called in from Springfield. Sonar boats scanned the water just north of the old concrete bridge where the current slowed. Cadaver dogs were brought to the banks. A few promising blips appeared on sonar, but when divers went down, they found nothing but sunken debris, rusted appliances, tree limbs, and scrap metal. The water was murky, the bottom soft and silty, shifting with each current. Days turned into a week, then 2. Still no sign of Greg, and still no sign of the Honda Accord. People started talking. Some whispered that Greg had staged his disappearance. Maybe the grief over Amy had finally caught up. Maybe he'd driven off to start a new life somewhere. Others believed the opposite, that someone had been waiting for him on that road, someone who knew his routine, someone who made sure he would never be found. The theories only multiplied when investigators retrieved the traffic footage from the 2 main intersections on the south side of town. The first showed Greg's car pulling through the gas station exit at 6:14 p.m. That lined up with the receipt Kyle had found on the kitchen counter. He'd bought a bottle of iced tea and a pack of gum. Greg appeared calm, normal. There were no passengers in the vehicle. But what stood out wasn't what the footage showed. It was what it didn't. The next intersection, just a mile south, should have picked him up heading toward the main road. But the car never appeared. There were no blind spots, no known glitches in the system. It was like he had turned off the grid between one intersection and the next. That left only a few possibilities. One of them was River Road, a narrow 2-lane road with no lights, little traffic, and no surveillance. It peeled off just before the second camera. A perfect blind route. Investigators questioned people who lived along the stretch. A retired couple recalled hearing what they thought was a loud thump that night, around 7:30. Something heavy, they said, like a tree falling. They hadn't reported it at the time. It wasn't that unusual. That part of the river was always cracking and shifting. But the timeline was close enough to make deputies listen. Search crews combed that area with renewed focus. For the first time, they considered the possibility of a crash site deep in the river or buried under a collapse. But again, no. Glass, no oil, no debris. Even with heavy silt, they should have found something. A floater, a ripple, a current pattern. They found nothing. What stood out more than anything was the complete lack of physical evidence. No skid marks, no broken branches, no signs of wildlife disruption. Greg had left his house at 6 p.m. sharp. Between then and sundown, the sky stayed clear, the road was dry, and no other cars had reported near misses or blocked paths. At the station, a large county map sat pinned to the wall. Dozens of colored tacks marked search zones. Every day a new line was drawn, a new direction explored. Each night, officers left with fewer answers than the night before. As weeks turned into a month, Greg's case went from active search to pending investigation. Kyle refused to accept it. He called news stations, taped flyers to every gas station window, and mailed letters to talk radio shows. He didn't believe his dad just vanished. He believed someone had done something. But without evidence, the sheriff's office had little to go on. Then, one evening, a woman came forward. She had been driving along Route 11, the highway just west of town, around the same time Greg disappeared. She said she saw a silver car pulled over by the tree line, hazards flashing. She thought the man looked distressed. She remembered slowing down but didn't stop. She was alone. It was getting dark. She had to be somewhere. When investigators asked for the exact spot, she hesitated. She couldn't remember it clearly. Just somewhere near mile marker 48, that stretch of road curved inland, away from the river, away from Greg's usual routes. If she was right, it meant he hadn't taken River Road at all. Or it meant someone else had been behind the wheel. By late summer of 2005, Greg Holman had been missing for over 4 months. The official search had lost momentum, but for the people who knew him, the mystery was only growing heavier. In the absence of answers, speculation took its place. Every day that passed without a trace opened the door a little wider to theories, some believable, others desperate. The Marlow Police Department continued to receive tips, though fewer and fewer held any weight. There was the trucker who thought he'd seen a silver Accord near a rest stop off I-80. A hiker claimed they'd found an old boot near the embankment. Someone in Indiana called to say Greg had carjacked them but couldn't provide a license plate or coherent description. All were dead ends, none connected back to Greg in any verifiable way. Still, law enforcement remained split on one central question. Did Greg leave of his own will, or did something happen to him? Detectives began looking deeper into Greg's mental health. There had been no clinical diagnosis, no official record of treatment, but grief can be quiet, and Greg had been carrying it alone for a long time. Some officers wondered if he'd chosen to disappear, to escape the memories, the monotony, and the pain of voluntary vanishing. Others weren't so sure. The ones who'd interviewed him over the years during routine traffic stops or local events didn't recall a man on the brink. They remembered a quiet, polite man, not a man running from something. Then there was the question of suicide. It's a word most families never want to consider. But investigators had to ask, if Greg had ended his life, where was the body? Where was the car? The river had been searched. The surrounding woods had been walked, mapped, and even partially cleared. No scent trails, no tire tracks leading off a cliff, no signal pings, not even a single fragment of glass. The family itself began to fracture under the weight of these possibilities. Kyle, now in his senior year of high school, was convinced something had happened to his dad, something violent. He believed Greg had been taken, robbed, killed, maybe dumped somewhere far away. He pointed out that Greg never brought large amounts of cash, didn't carry weapons, and rarely locked the car. He was trusting, especially in a town that had always felt safe. Too trusting, Kyle said. Other relatives, including Greg's sister Lorraine, thought differently. She started to suggest that maybe Greg hadn't been doing as well as they thought. She'd noticed he'd stopped going to church and stopped returning calls as quickly. Maybe there were signs they had all missed. Lorraine said she found a notebook at Greg's house after the disappearance, filled with strange doodles and half-finished lists, errands that were never completed, and grocery lists that ended in blank spaces. She wondered aloud if it pointed to early signs of cognitive decline. Maybe Greg had simply got lost, confused, and drove himself somewhere he couldn't come back from. Kyle refused to entertain it. He said that if his dad had been confused, he never showed it at home. He cooked, paid bills, and drove the same routes every day. He hadn't forgotten a single birthday, hadn't once called Kyle by the wrong name. There were no doctor visits, no episodes. To Kyle, those theories weren't explanations, they were excuses. Then came something unexpected. In mid-September, a group of teenagers walking through a wooded patch behind an abandoned barn off Route 17 came across something half buried in the dirt. A partially burnt wallet, charred around the edges, warped by heat, and split down the spine. Inside, there were several melted plastic cards, too damaged to read. But one ID photo remained mostly intact. The face was faded, but familiar. It looked like Greg. The area was immediately cordoned off. Forensics came in to test for fingerprints, blood, and any traces of DNA. The wallet was compared to a photograph Kyle provided. It matched Greg's model, a simple black trifold he'd had for years. The structure, the stitching, even the torn corner where Greg had once snagged it on a nail. But there were no definitive links, no DNA, no serial numbers, nothing to say for sure it had belonged to him. Still, it reignited the investigation. If the wallet was Greg's, how did it get there? The barn was miles from any of Greg's usual routes. It wasn't on the river road. It wasn't near any hiking trails or campsites, and the field surrounding it had already been searched back in May. That left only two explanations. Either someone had planted it later, or it had been overlooked. Investigators brought in cadaver dogs again, focused on the barn's perimeter. They swept the area for days but found no new evidence, no clothing, no car parts, no bones. Just the wallet. Burnt, abandoned, isolated. To Kyle, it was confirmation. Someone had taken his father, dumped the wallet, and tried to destroy evidence. Maybe they got spooked. Maybe something had gone wrong. But to the rest of the family, the wallet raised more questions than answers. If Greg had burned it himself, why? If someone else had done it, what else were they hiding? With no clear proof and no body, the wallet joined a growing list of unsolved fragments, pieces of a puzzle that refused to come together. By October, tensions within the family had hardened into silence. Kyle stopped talking to Lorraine. Holidays came and went. Friends stopped asking. But Kyle couldn't let it go. Not yet. Because if the wallet had surfaced, then maybe something else would too. By early 2006, the trail had gone cold. No more wallet fragments, no new witnesses, no sightings. For investigators, it became a question of whether they had truly missed something, or if there had never been anything there to find. Months had passed since the last viable lead, and protocol demanded one final review before a case was unofficially placed in the inactive file. So they circled back. Re-interviews are routine in cold cases, not because people lie, but because memories change. They soften, blend, or sharpen in strange ways over time. Detectives returned to Greg Holman's last known circles, co-workers at the grain elevator, the two old-timers who fished near the river, the cashier at the gas station, and even Kyle's football coach, who used to carpool with Greg when Amy was in treatment. Most didn't have anything new to say. Some didn't want to talk at all, but a few did remember something they hadn't thought much of at the time. Mike Driscoll, a longtime co-worker, recalled a moment 2 or 3 weeks before the disappearance. He said Greg had come into work visibly shaken, quiet, distracted, hand shaking slightly as he poured coffee. When Mike asked what was wrong, Greg brushed it off. But a few days later, Mike saw Greg in the parking lot of the Marathon gas station just outside town. He was in a tense argument with another man, one Mike didn't recognize. The guy was tall, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, and standing beside an older red pickup with rust on the rear. Wheel well. Mike didn't hear what they were saying, but Greg looked angry and scared. The other man kept stepping closer. Mike assumed it was some kind of private matter and didn't intervene. At the time, it didn't seem like something worth reporting. But now, almost a year later, with Greg still missing, it stuck with him. Investigators logged the tip and asked for a description. Mike didn't get the truck's plate number, but he remembered the sticker in the back window, a faded American flag. the kind handed out at state fairs. It wasn't much, but it was something. Detectives reviewed traffic and surveillance footage from that marathon station, going back as far as the systems allowed. Most of it had been erased. That station only kept recordings for 2 weeks. But they did find a blurry snapshot of a red pickup matching Mike's description, parked for 6 minutes on March 27th. No driver was visible. The plate wasn't readable. It wasn't enough. They reached out to surrounding counties, asking about similar trucks. A few were found. None linked to Greg. No history, no warrants. One had been junked and one had moved out of state. One owner was dead. The mystery man at the gas station became one of those details that haunts a case. Just plausible enough to chase, just vague enough to elude. Was he a stranger passing through? Someone from Greg's past? No one could say. And Greg had never mentioned it. Not to Kyle, not to co-workers, not in his emails. The last texts from his phone were routine, confirming a work shift, asking Kyle to pick up milk, nothing more. Other stories surfaced during the second round of interviews. A neighbor recalled seeing a silver car parked on their street after midnight, the week Greg went missing. They hadn't seen who was in it. Another said they thought Greg had seemed on edge lately. One even suggested he was being followed, though when asked why, they admitted it was just a hunch. None of it added up to more than fragments, not evidence, not proof. The truth was, Greg Holman didn't lead a complicated life. He worked, came home, cooked meals, drove at night, and kept to himself. He didn't drink, he didn't gamble, he didn't fight with anyone, no affairs, no criminal record, no mental breakdowns. He had loved his wife, and after she died, he had tried, quietly and painfully, to keep going. Investigators dug through phone records, financials, and old emails again. Nothing popped, no sudden withdrawals, no strange calls, no red flags. Just a man gradually fading from the systems that once confirmed he existed. As the case dragged on, media attention faded. Local news stopped running updates. The flyers yellowed and tore, some taken down to make room for newer tragedies. The town, as it always did, began to shift focus. New births, new jobs, other emergencies. That's how small towns survive, by moving forward, even when they don't want to. Kyle tried to keep the case alive. He ran a website. He kept calling the sheriff's office. But the silence was louder now. The calls are less frequent. The sense of urgency from the early months was gone, replaced by quiet routine. A report would be pulled once a quarter. A form checked off. The file moved back into the drawer. Privately, some officers admitted they didn't believe the case would ever be solved. No body, no crime scene, no hard evidence. They'd done what they could. But with no new leads, no witness cooperation, and nothing to anchor a new search, they were stuck. The red truck remained a question. So did the burnt wallet. But both had become like echoes, distant, thin, fading with time. Something may have happened to Greg Holman. Or nothing did. That was the terrifying part. No screams, no final call, no confession. Just a man who left his driveway one evening and never came home. But for Kyle, it wasn't over. He knew what silence felt like. He'd lived with it for nearly a year. And even if everyone else had accepted the unknown, he hadn't. Because there were still roads unsearched, still places unexplored, still questions no one had asked. And something in his gut told him the truth was still out there. It just hadn't surfaced yet. Time has a way of dulling public memory. For most people in Marlow, Greg Holman's disappearance had long since faded into the past. It became one of those stories people mentioned when driving past a certain stretch of road or chatting at a bar. Remember that guy who vanished years ago? The details blurred. The urgency vanished. People moved on. But Kyle Holman never did. By the time he turned 31, Kyle had become a quiet fixture in the online world of unresolved disappearances. He read every missing persons case he could find. He joined forums, archived files, and requested police records through FOIA. It wasn't curiosity anymore. It was compulsion. The search for his father had taken root so deeply it became indistinguishable from his identity. He left Marlow in his early 20s, but he returned every fall. He still kept the house, still mowed the lawn, still walked the old routes Greg used to drive. He couldn't let it go. Over time, he began to notice the same stories playing out again and again in other towns. Men going missing, cars vanishing, families are left with only theories. He started to wonder how many of these cases were like his father's, quiet, rural, forgotten. So in 2023, Kyle launched a podcast. He called it Gone Quiet. Just his voice, a cheap mic, and old case files. At first, it was just about Greg. He told the story chronologically. Every episode was slow, methodical, and personal. He played snippets from old voicemails, read witness statements, and interviewed former investigators who'd retired or moved away. Then he began covering other cases. People began to listen. In the fourth episode, Kyle brought on a retired state trooper who had worked briefly on the search in 2005. The man's memory was sharp and his tone careful. But midway through the interview, he mentioned something Kyle had never heard before. A report filed the week after Greg disappeared by a local utility worker who had spotted what looked like deep tire impressions near the edge of the riverbank. The report was logged, but according to the trooper, it was never fully followed up. Kyle froze. He asked where. The man couldn't recall the exact spot, only that it was near the old bridge bend, south of River Road where the current was slower. Kyle ended the interview early. That night, he filed a request for the original report. It took weeks, but it arrived. It was real. Dated April 25, 2005. Logged, stamped, but never assigned for follow-up. The location was listed, a drainage runoff near mile marker 22. Kyle didn't sleep that night. He printed maps, old satellite photos, and topography reports from the county archives. That part of the river had never been searched thoroughly, only scanned briefly during the early days, when the search radius was still wide, and the assumption had been Greg had simply gotten lost. But the river there was deep. The silt ran thick, and with enough current, a car could be swallowed whole and never surface. The next day, Kyle hired a private investigator. Her name was Rachel Novak, former homicide detective from Springfield, sharp, experienced, not the kind to entertain wild theories. But she listened. She read the report. She drove with Kyle out to the riverbank, boots sinking into the softened ground. They stood together, watching the water move slowly and silently. Rachel didn't promise anything, but she agreed to help. Over the next several weeks, Kyle and Rachel compiled a detailed timeline. They re-examined the original sonar maps used by the 2005 dive teams. They discovered that coverage near mile marker 22 had been incomplete. Equipment limitations and poor visibility had cut the scan short. No divers had ever gone in. The focus had shifted elsewhere too quickly. Kyle couldn't believe it. Somehow, this one corner of the river, the only place where fresh tire impressions had been reported, had never been fully explored. Kyle went back to the podcast. In episode 7, he laid out everything they'd found. He played the audio of the 2005 tip report. Then he asked for help. Volunteers, divers, equipment. He didn't expect much, but the response surprised him. A local search and rescue hobbyist group reached out. Then, a retired sonar technician. Then, a man from Kentucky who had lost his own brother and had been searching riverbeds ever since. By fall, Kyle had a small team. They planned a sweep, 5 boats, 2 divers, and new sonar equipment. The search would begin at the bend, working inward, grid by grid. Rachel helped with logistics. Kyle handled the recordings. Everything was documented, every scan logged. It was the first time in nearly 20 years that anyone had touched the case with real focus. That stretch of the Embry River had changed over time. Erosion had altered the shoreline, trees had fallen, but the slope near mile marker 22 remained steep, and the silt at the base was dense enough to conceal something large. Kyle stood on the bank with a recorder in hand, heart pounding. After all these years, this was the closest he had ever been to a real lead. Not a rumor, not a theory. Evidence. Something someone had seen, filed and forgotten. If a car had gone into that river, it may still be there, and Kyle had every intention of finding it. In October of 2025, the river finally gave something back. It had taken nearly 20 years of silence, of questions with no answers, of theories that wore thin under the weight of time. But for Kyle Holman, the moment didn't come as a surprise. Not entirely. He had always believed the answer had been sitting there, buried just beneath the surface, right where no one had looked closely enough. The sonar scans began just after sunrise on a Sunday morning. Kyle stood at the edge of the embankment, eyes locked on the slow-moving curve of the Embry River. The dive team worked quietly. 2 locals, 1 volunteer from the city, and the retired sonar tech who had offered his equipment after hearing the podcast. The grid was laid out in sections, marked by weighted buoys. The plan was to scan every inch of the riverbed near the bend, just south of mile marker 22, using both side-scan sonar and sub-bottom profiling, technology that hadn't been available when Greg Holman disappeared in 2005. The first few hours passed without incident. The sonar returned images of silt piles, tree trunks, and garbage, a rusted-out metal drum, a tangle of fencing, nothing significant. Then, just before noon, the screen lit up with a distorted mass, rectangular, angled slightly, half buried. The edges were soft, worn down by time and sediment, but the shape was unmistakable. Vehicle dimensions, roughly the size of a compact sedan. They dropped a marker buoy and prepped the divers. Visibility underwater was poor, just over 2 feet. The bottom was thick with layers of silt and fine sand, shifting with every movement. But less than 15 minutes into the dive, one of the men surfaced and gave the signal. They'd found metal. The rear end was exposed, tilted nose down into the riverbed. It took nearly an hour to clear the surrounding debris. Then came confirmation. A partial license plate. It matched the records on file, the 2001 silver Honda Accord registered to Greg Holman. The car had been there all along. As the divers continued their survey, more details emerged. The roof had caved in slightly, crushed by years of pressure. The windows were shattered, the front bumper was torn away, but the body was intact, mostly sealed, mostly undisturbed. Inside, wedged beneath the passenger side floor mat, they found a fragment of what appeared to be a bone. Later analysis would confirm it was human. Forensics arrived later that afternoon. They worked carefully, documenting everything in place before attempting removal. The mud had acted like a sealant, preserving certain materials while dissolving others. The interior was waterlogged, but a few objects remained: a metal keyring, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, and the decayed frame of a leather wallet. The driver's seatbelt was unbuckled. The passenger side was smeared in something darker. It wasn't blood, at least not fresh, but residue that would later test positive for trace human proteins. The glove box had snapped open in the crash. Inside, they found a photo, faded, water-damaged, torn diagonally through the middle. It was Greg and Amy. The handwriting on the back had blurred to ink blotches. Only one word was still legible: home. Kyle watched it all from the bank, silent. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. There was just this stillness, a kind of frozen focus he couldn't explain. He knew what they were finding. He had prepared himself for it, night after night, for nearly 2 decades. But nothing prepares you for the reality of bone. News spread quickly. Local media picked it up within 24 hours. Headlines called it a breakthrough, a long-lost mystery solved. But Kyle didn't feel closure. If anything, the discovery brought new questions, questions he couldn't ignore. Why had the car gone off that specific stretch of road? Why was it angled toward the river, not away from it? And why had no one found it during the original search? Theories resurfaced immediately. Investigators suggested it may have been a simple accident. Greg had driven too fast, missed the curve, and lost control. But Kyle didn't believe it. His father knew those roads. He'd driven them hundreds of times. And then there was the tire report from 2005, the one Kyle had unearthed. It had placed fresh marks near that very same bend, yet the initial search had skipped it. The dive logs from that spring had mistakenly listed the bend as non-navigable, a designation meant for shallow zones. The riverbed had changed, yes, but not enough to explain that oversight. Others raised the possibility of a staged crash. Maybe someone else had been driving, that the body had been placed there, or the car rolled in later. But there were no signs of forced entry, no indications of a second person, no blood on the steering wheel, just fragments, bone, metal, and mud. A full recovery took 3 days. The vehicle was lifted from the river by crane, loaded onto a flatbed, and driven under police escort to the state lab. The official autopsy was limited. After 20 years underwater, only partial remains were found, fragments of a jaw, a femur, and several teeth. But dental records confirmed what Kyle already knew. It was Greg. The cause of death was listed as undetermined, no trauma, no blunt force, no fractures inconsistent with the crash. The final report offered little else. The file was updated. Case status, inactive, pending new evidence. To most, it was the end of the story. The missing man had been found. The car explained, closure delivered. But Kyle knew better. He had found the river. He had found the car. But he hadn't found the truth. Not yet. The confirmation came 3 days after the car was pulled from the river. The dental records matched. The bone fragments, though degraded, were enough. The remains found inside the Honda Accord belonged to Greg Holman. After 20 years, the man who vanished during a routine evening drive was no longer missing. He was home. But the discovery didn't bring closure. It only opened more questions, ones the evidence couldn't explain. The forensic report listed the cause of death as undetermined. There were no signs of blunt force trauma, no bullet wounds, no knife marks, no broken bones that couldn't be attributed to the collapse of the vehicle under 2 decades of river silt and sediment. And yet, the passenger seat was soaked with a deep rust-colored stain. A chemical test confirmed what everyone suspected. It had once been blood. Human blood. So much that it soaked through the cushion and pooled beneath the floor mat. But it didn't match Greg. Kyle sat across from the forensic examiner when the results were delivered. It was a strange moment. After all the years, all the theories, all the nights he'd spent trying to picture what might have happened to his father, he never imagined something so strange. Blood in the passenger seat, seatbelt unfastened, no trauma, no clear cause of death. It made no sense. Inside the vehicle, investigators had found several personal items, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a corroded wristwatch that had stopped at 6:47 p.m., a rusted keyring, a half-disintegrated wallet. Most of it was too damaged to recover anything meaningful. But inside the glove box, pressed beneath a water-damaged manual, they found a photograph. Torn at the edge, color faded, the image showed Greg and Amy standing outside their old house in the fall, leaves scattered on the lawn. The back had been labeled in Greg's handwriting, just one word, still barely legible through the blur of time. Home. Next to the photo was a receipt, crumpled, curled with moisture, but intact enough to read. It was from a gas station nearly 12 miles south of Marlow, dated the night Greg disappeared. Timestamp, 6:18 p.m. That was 15 minutes after he'd left the house, heading west. The gas station, however, was in the opposite direction. He shouldn't have been anywhere near it. Kyle stared at the receipt for nearly an hour. He remembered that night like it had just happened. Greg had rinsed his plate, grabbed his jacket, and said he was going for a drive. Kyle assumed he was headed toward the usual back roads near the river, the familiar loop. But the receipt placed him going south, toward a different stretch, of highway, out of town entirely. It was a deliberate turn, not random, not mistaken, and it changed everything. Investigators tried to pull security footage, but after 20 years, there was nothing to find. The gas station had changed ownership multiple times. The DVR system was long gone. No logs, no backups, nothing. All that remained was the timestamp, the store address, and the list of items purchased, a bottle of iced tea and a pack of chewing gum. The exact same things Greg had bought at his regular gas station in Marlow 2 days earlier. It felt rehearsed. The details started to grind against each other. If Greg had bought those items in the opposite direction from his usual route, why hadn't anyone seen him? Why hadn't his car been picked up on the traffic cams from that highway? If he had been alone, whose blood was in the passenger seat? And if there had been someone else with him, where did they go? The unfastened seatbelt only added more confusion. Greg was known for being meticulous. He always wore it, always clicked it before backing out of the driveway. The absence of the buckle, combined with the blood on the opposite seat, suggested something had gone wrong, fast. Either he had unbuckled in a panic, or he had never been driving at all. Kyle brought the report to Rachel Novak. The retired detective had seen plenty of unusual scenes before, but even she struggled to piece it together. She believed Greg had met someone that night, someone off his usual path, someone he either trusted or feared just enough to follow. Her theory was blunt. Greg hadn't driven into the river alone, and the blood in the car belonged to someone who didn't want to be found. But theories weren't evidence. The police reopened the file briefly, but found no new leads, no fingerprints, no DNA match from the blood, no indication of another person at the scene. There was no registration of a second vehicle near that stretch of road. And because the car had been submerged for so long, even accident reconstruction specialists couldn't determine how it entered the water, whether Greg was behind the wheel or someone else had been. Kyle sat with the evidence for days, the photo in the glove box, the faded ink, the reverse direction of travel, the seatbelt, the blood. Everything pointed to intention. But whose? He began to wonder if his father had discovered something that night, some hidden detail he never told anyone. Or maybe after years of holding himself together, he had finally gone to confront someone from his past. A name he'd never mentioned, a secret he'd never shared. Whatever happened in that car didn't end there. And Kyle knew that if he wanted the full truth, he'd have to go back further, before the drive, before the river, to the people Greg Holman had left behind. The discovery of the receipt changed everything. Kyle couldn't explain why exactly. It wasn't a confession or a map. It didn't point to a killer. But it was out of place. A detail that had gone overlooked for years, and if that had been missed, what else had slipped through? He went back through the original witness statements, every tip, every name. And there it was, tucked inside a summary filed 6 days after Greg's disappearance, a reference to a man named Alan Greer. At the time, it was nothing more than a side note. Former co-worker, not currently in town. No known involvement, but that was it. No interview, no follow-up, just a name that vanished into the rest of the paper trail. Kyle didn't recognize it at first, but when he asked Rachel to dig into the old employee logs from the grain elevator, the memory came back. Alan had worked there for a few months, maybe longer, doing night shifts and inventory. He was quiet, barely said a word to anyone, but people remembered him, mostly because of the way he left. In March of 2005, just weeks before Greg disappeared, Alan was caught stealing supplies from the warehouse. Not just food or scrap, actual equipment, wiring, chains, fuel canisters. When confronted, he denied everything, then stormed out. No charges were filed, but he never came back. And then, almost like clockwork, Greg went missing. Rachel pulled Alan's personnel file. It was thin, no address listed, no emergency contact. Just a P.O. box and a copy of a driver's license issued out of Kentucky. But what stood out wasn't the paperwork. It was what people started to remember once the name resurfaced. One co-worker recalled an argument between Alan and Greg near the storage lot. Another mentioned that Alan used to linger in the break room, listening more than speaking. Someone else swore they'd seen Alan's truck parked near the edge of Greg's neighborhood one morning, just sitting there. At the time, no one thought to say anything. But now, the descriptions started lining up. A red pickup, old, rusted with a missing rear hubcap. The same kind of truck was reported near the Marathon station where Greg had been seen arguing with a man in a hoodie, just days before he vanished. Kyle asked the sheriff's office if they had ever questioned Alan back in 2005. They hadn't. By the time Alan's name came up in a witness statement, he was already gone. Moved, according to the grain elevator manager, without warning. No forwarding address. The report had been marked low priority. Greg's disappearance wasn't yet considered suspicious. The file sat untouched for nearly 20 years. Rachel began digging deeper: property records, employment history, old addresses. Eventually, she tracked Alan Greer to a trailer park in southern Missouri, where he had apparently lived under a different name, Alan Greaves, from 2006 until his death in 2014. The cause of death was listed as a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He'd been found by a neighbor after missing 2 rent payments. No note, no family, no service. Kyle drove there, himself. The trailer has since been sold. The new tenant didn't know anything, but Kyle managed to speak with the former landlord, an elderly woman who remembered Alan as reclusive, paranoid, and twitchy. She said he didn't speak much, but always paid cash. When asked if Alan ever talked about Illinois, she paused, then said yes. Once. She recalled him saying he left a job up north because of bad blood. When pressed, he'd gone quiet and said, "People don't forget, especially when they're right." Kyle asked if she'd ever seen the truck. She nodded. Red, rusted, parked out back under a carport for years, until the day she found him. The police had it towed. It was scrapped 2 weeks later. Kyle managed to track down the towing company. The records confirmed it. 1987 Ford Ranger, faded red, missing rear hubcap. The same description, down to the last detail. It had been right there all along. But Alan was gone. Dead nearly a decade. The truck was destroyed. No forensics to test, no witnesses left, nothing to interrogate. The timeline matched, the pattern matched. But it wasn't enough. Rachel took the findings to the county prosecutor. A formal request was submitted to reopen the case as a suspicious death. But without direct evidence, no eyewitness, no confession, no physical proof, Alan couldn't be declared a suspect. The case was upgraded, but no charges were ever filed. There was no one left to arrest. Still, Kyle couldn't let it go. He began connecting dots that weren't in the police reports. Alan had worked nights at the grain elevator. Greg had supervised that shift once a week. Kyle remembered his dad mentioning a problem with someone skimming supplies. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, just workplace drama. But what if Greg had discovered something? What if he'd confronted Alan again, outside the gas station, alone, off camera? It didn't prove anything, but it made sense. The blood in the passenger seat, the changed direction on the receipt, the unbuckled seatbelt. Greg may have picked Alan up that night, or been forced to drive. Whatever happened next, it ended with a car in the river and a man no one thought to question. For Kyle, it was the closest thing to an answer he'd ever had. But it was too late. The suspect was on the ground, and the only thing that could still speak was silence. By late winter, the case had reached a standstill again. The car was found. The bones were confirmed. The circumstantial pieces, Alan Greer, the blood, the reverse direction, painted a story no one could prove. Law enforcement labeled it unresolved but closed. No suspect, no charges, no physical evidence linking anyone to Greg Holman's final moments. To most, the story had reached its end. But Kyle wasn't ready to let it rest. Not yet. There was one piece of the puzzle no one had fully examined: Greg's cell phone. In 2005, phones weren't what they are today. There was no GPS tracking, no automatic cloud backups, no synced voice memos or biometric locks. But they did log tower pings, call histories, and voicemail data, if preserved. Kyle had already submitted records requests for Greg's cell activity years ago, but back then, providers only kept those logs for a limited time. After 7 years, most of it was gone. Still, after finding the car and reigniting public attention, Kyle tried again. And this time, with the help of Rachel Novak, the request was escalated to a historical archive division. They weren't able to recover messages, but they found something else. A tower log from the night Greg vanished. A final signal pinged at 6:41 p.m., 17 minutes after he left home. The location: a cellular tower 5 miles south of where the car was eventually found, near a now-defunct service station, not along Greg's usual route, and not anywhere close to where police believed he'd been heading. Rachel cross-referenced the tower radius with the known locations: Greg's house, the gas station where he made the purchase, and the riverbank where the car was found. The ping was outside the triangle. Off-grid. Alone. It added another question to a long list of unanswered ones. Why would Greg be near that tower that early in the timeline? And why had the phone never pinged again? Kyle dug deeper. He located the carrier's backup archive and discovered something no one had looked for before: Greg's voicemail data. It wasn't stored on the phone itself, but on the company's server, a legacy system that had been phased out and then digitized for archival in 2011. The file was labeled Incoming, April 17, 6:44 p.m. The system marked it as incomplete, poor quality. It had never been reviewed. The voicemail was just under 12 seconds long. When Kyle played it for the first time, it was almost entirely static, muffled, distant, like the sound of wind rushing through a cracked window. At first, it sounded like a pocket dial, or maybe the result of water damage. But just before the end, there was something else. A sound. A voice. Faint, unintelligible, buried beneath layers of white noise. Then it cut out. Kyle had the audio sent to a forensic sound lab in St. Louis. The engineer was skeptical. Most calls with that much static weren't recoverable, but they ran it through multiple filters: spectral enhancement, frequency isolation, and noise reduction. By the end of the week, the engineer called back with one word: river. It came at the 9-second mark, soft, whispered, trailing upward like a question or a plea. It wasn't clear who said it. There was no matching vocal print to compare it to, but it was there. One word. Unmistakable. River. Kyle listened to that clip over and over. It didn't sound like his father. It didn't sound like him either. It was just too distorted to know for sure. But the timing matched. The location matched. And the message, if it was a message, echoed everything Kyle had spent years trying to prove. He turned it over to the authorities. But the sheriff's department didn't consider it actionable. There was no context, no identifiable voice, and no metadata beyond the timestamp. They acknowledged the ping and filed the voicemail under supplemental evidence. That was all. To Kyle, it was more than that. He imagined his father at that moment, alone in a car, maybe frightened, maybe injured, maybe not alone at all. Something had made him hit the call button. Something or someone had caused the message to end before anything else could be said. And if Greg had been reaching out, that meant he knew. He knew where he was going or where he'd been taken. He knew what might happen next. River. One word. A breadcrumb. Too late to change anything, but not too late to be heard. Kyle played the voicemail on the podcast. He didn't tell listeners what the audio engineers believed they heard. He just let the clip run. Then he asked, "Who do you think it was?" The episode became the most downloaded in the series. Dozens of interpretations poured in. Some claimed they heard another voice layered beneath the static. Others thought it was just noise. But one message was repeated again and again in listener emails. He was trying to say goodbye. Rachel didn't agree. She believed Greg had been signaling for help, not closure. That maybe he'd tried to call emergency services but misdialed. That maybe someone else, Alan, or someone connected to him, was already in the car. It was impossible to know. The rest of the voicemail was lost to time. The data was corrupted. Nothing else could be pulled. But the ping, the voice, the word. They lingered. For 20 years, no one had looked there. No one had asked why the last signal came from a place off the map. Now, Kyle had to wonder. What else had been missed, just beyond the tower line? The case was never officially closed, but there was nothing left to investigate. After 20 years, Greg Holman's remains were returned to his family in a small sealed container, labeled with nothing more than his name and a number. The official cause of death remained unchanged, undetermined. No evidence of trauma, no confirmed foul play, no timeline the authorities could prove. The case remained technically open, but inactive. The file was thick with reports and photographs, but no conclusion. Only a question mark that had weathered 2 decades and still refused to break. For a long time, Kyle thought finding the car would be the answer. He imagined the moment so many times growing up, seeing the silver Accord lifted from the water, confirming it was real, getting some final moment of certainty that would help him move on. But it didn't happen that way. The river gave back the car, it gave back the bones, but not the why, not the how, and definitely not the who. Theories still lingered: the receipt, the voicemail, the blood in the passenger seat, the name of a man who died with no one to bury him. None of it added up to proof. Kyle kept hoping something would surface: DNA, a second voicemail, a hidden witness, but the trail was cold again, and this time, there were no new technologies left to help. Rachel filed her final report in March. She laid everything out: Alan Greer's background, the location of the phone ping, the argument at the gas station, the similarities between the truck sighting and the vehicle Alan had left behind. She included the voicemail transcription and audio analysis. Her conclusion wasn't definitive, but it was clear. She believed Greg Holman met with another person that night. She believed something went wrong, and she believed that person, whoever they were, was likely responsible for the events that led Greg into the river. But belief wasn't enough for court, and it wouldn't bring Greg back. Kyle held a private memorial a week later. It wasn't in a church. It wasn't in the cemetery where Greg's parents were buried. It was by the bend in the river, just off the dirt road where the sonar team had found the car. The trees were bare, the water moving slow. It was quiet. Just a few people came: Rachel, a couple of friends, and the retired deputy who had taken the original missing person report all those years ago. Kyle didn't speak for long. There wasn't much to say. Just a thank you and goodbye. They scattered a handful of Greg's ashes into the river. Kyle watched them drift for a moment, then disappear, the same way Greg had. Later that night, Kyle sat in his father's old recliner, playing the voicemail again. The one word, river, echoed through his headphones. It was all that remained, a whisper recorded by accident or on purpose. He didn't know. Maybe it had been a plea, maybe a warning, or maybe just a final breath, captured in the last seconds before everything went dark. He thought back to the last time he saw his dad, standing by the front door, jacket on, keys in hand, the porch light just starting to flicker on as the sun dipped below the trees. Greg had smiled, said he'd be back in an hour, and walked out into the evening like it was any other night. No one realized it was goodbye. For years, Kyle had lived in the spaces between moments, filling in the blanks, chasing shadows, convincing himself that if he just found one more clue, one more record, one more angle, he could rewrite the ending. But in the end, the story hadn't given him resolution. It had only handed him what the river allowed: a shell of a car, scattered bones, and a tangle of half-truths frozen in time. There would be no arrests, no trials, no deathbed confession. The only suspect died alone in a trailer hundreds of miles away, taking whatever truth he had with him. Whether Alan Greer was involved or not, Kyle would never know, and the blood, still unmatched, remained a silent question soaked into fabric that would never speak. But despite it all, Kyle had found something. Not closure, not justice, but wait. He'd given his father a place in the world again, pulled him out of the space between missing and forgotten, and sometimes that had to be enough. Years later, when people asked about the case, Kyle would tell them the story the same way every time. He'd lay out the facts: when Greg left, when the car was found, what the voicemail said. He wouldn't dramatize it. He wouldn't speculate. He'd let them sit in silence the way he had. Because the truth was simple and terrible. Greg Holman went for a drive one April evening and never came home. And for 20 years, no one knew where he went. Until the river, without warning, gave part of him back. Not all of him. Just enough to make the rest unbearable. And what it kept, whatever happened in that final hour, whoever was with him, whatever was said or done before the water closed in, remains buried in silt. The mystery didn't end. It just stopped.